So there's three components to this. I'm going to take you through each of them in order, and then by the end of the video, you will know how to make investors an offer so good that they simply can't refuse. So number one is you have to hook them in emotionally. You got to give them that emotional punch to the gut, because just relying on the numbers, on the commercial side, on the logical side of it, isn't going to be enough to get them over the line. And the reason that this exists is because film is so high risk, high reward. And there are so many other places that these investors could put their hard-earned cash. There's so many other assets that are less risky, that can yield decent returns, that just make much more commercial sense and that they can understand, right? Film investment is still very unknown for most investors. They don't quite understand how it works. So you have all these things working against you, and for an investor, that logical side of their brain is going, well, this doesn't really make sense. And so that's why on the emotional side, you really have to hook them in with that, and then you have to use the logical side to really just make them confident and comfortable that you know what you're doing. So going back to the emotional side, you really need to find like what are these emotional hooks that your film has that's going to allow you to identify the right investors and then get them hooked into your project. So the way we do this is we look at two things: the film and the filmmakers. So when we're thinking about the film, we're looking at what are the characteristics of that film, and with the filmmakers it's the same. What are the characteristics of the filmmakers, and how can we use those to start extracting some emotional hooks? So with the film, on the film side of it, we look at things like what's the subject matter of the film, what are the themes of the film, where is the film being shot, right? Because some investors just want to see production happening in the city or the town that they're in. So that can be an emotional reason, right? They could be proud of that local community and want to see production going on. So that is, a potential hook that you could look at. When you're thinking of the theme, is there any particular theme that you're exploring that might make this film, carry more of an emotional hook to a potential investor? An example of this is like, let's say you're making a film and the character's an alcoholic. Well, if you found investors who have recovered from alcoholism and who are now successful, they're going to see themselves in that character. And so there's going to be an emotional response when you pitch that film to them. So that's on the film side. And then on the filmmaker's side, we're thinking about, what are the communities that a filmmaker belongs to that could allow them to go out and find potential people who want to support their work. So it could be, a sports organization or association that they belong to. It could be a religious community. It could be like a local community. So just, it's looking at those characteristics of the filmmaker and saying, well, what communities do they belong to? I'll give you an example again. So my background is my parents and grandparents are Greek, so I'm a Greek Australian. And so when we raised finance on a film recently, we went out to the Greek Australian community to try and raise finance from them. And the reason that we did that is because, I have an affiliation with that community, so it makes sense. And so there can be that emotional hook again between the investor and myself. So you want to think about the film and the filmmaker in terms of the characteristics and then try and extract those hooks out. So that's number one. Number two is you have to be prepared. So if you get to the point where you're pitching to an investor, you need to make sure that you have all your assets ready to go. There can't be one chink in that armor, because if there is, the whole thing can fall over. And I was having a chat with a filmmaker just today who's managed to get his film financed, and he's going into production in a couple of months. And the reason that one of the reasons he attributed to his ability to get this film financed is just that when he met with these producers who were able to finance the film, he was ready. He had his script ready, his pitch deck ready, his investor deck ready, his budget done, his storyboards done. He was production ready. He was ready to go. And so you can understand for these financiers, if they're looking at a bunch of projects and they're wondering which ones they should choose first, or which ones they should prioritize or put their money into, it makes total sense that they're gonna go with the one that's furthest along, that's most prepared, that's pretty much ready to go into production, so that when they greenlight it, they can turn it around really quickly, get it into production and get it out into the world. So if you're going out and pitching to investors, you have to have all your assets ready to go, because then it makes it much harder for them again to refuse your offer. If they have questions and you're able to answer them instantly, or if they ask if you have a document and it's ready, right, you can send that immediately, then that goes to the logical side, right? So you've hooked them in emotionally, and now what you're doing is you're saying, you know, I have all, like, I'm so prepared to go. This logical side is going to make sense to them, and so you're then basically kind of locking in the emotional and the logical side in this investor's brain, and so for them it then makes sense to invest into the film. So that's the second one. And the third one is basically delaying the time period between payment and repayment. So this one's a bit trickier, but you want to think about how you can decrease the time between when the investor gives you money and when you give the investor money back, right? Or when you could potentially give them money back, because obviously not all films make money, but your film should at least be making some money where you're returning some money to the investors, right? And so if you can decrease that time period, that's going to increase the attractiveness of that offer. So a couple ways that you could do this is you could basically like pitch to investors, get them all lined up, but not necessarily ask for their funds until you get everyone kind of ready, lined up, and then get them to invest all within a time frame. And that period of time should be right before you go into pre-production. Now, depending on what country you're in, this can be easier or harder. So for example, in Australia, a way that we could do this is, you know, we can pitch investors, we can sign them up with an investment agreement, but they don't need to transfer that money straight away, right? They can transfer it at a later date. Now, is there some risk that the investor will pull out between now and the time that you close finance? Of course, but even if they transferred the money into an escrow account or a trust account, I mean, there are always ways that they could get that money back out. So I don't think that it's more risky. But what you're doing is, if they're able to keep using their money for other assets, if they're able to keep generating a return on their money before you need it, then that's great, right? If you, on the other hand, if you got the money from them and then there's like this 6-month period where you're just raising finance and you've got their money and it's not earning interest, it's not working for them, and it's just taking, like you're just adding the time that it's going to take to repay them, that is going to make the offer less attractive to them. So if you can decrease that time frame, that's what you want to do. Another way that you could do this is if you've already gone out and shot a film and you have a finished film, well, you're already like 2, 3, 4 months ahead of where you would usually be. So if you're raising money during post-production, you've already decreased that time frame. And so that can be an attractive offer, right? If you go to an investor and say, or right at the end, so if you put this money in, it goes straight to distribution, and then we expect to pay you, you know, X amount of months or quarters after. So that's number 3, just shrink that time frame between payment and repayment. So that's it. Those are the 3 components. That's the way you make an offer to investors that they simply can't refuse.